They say cats are independent creatures, but sometimes they surprise us in the most extraordinary ways. This is the story of Whiskers, a stray cat who became a hero overnight, proving that courage and love come in all shapes and sizes. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a tabby cat named Whiskers had spent most of his life roaming the streets. No one knew exactly where he had come from, but the locals had grown fond of him. The children would leave out small bowls of food, and elderly Mrs. Thompson from down the street always had a warm blanket on her porch for him. But Whiskers never stayed in one place for too long, until the day he found the Reynolds family. The Reynolds had recently moved into the neighborhood, bringing with them their newborn baby, Lily. Unlike the other houses, theirs was still unfamiliar to Whiskers, but something about it drew him in. He would often sit on their front steps, peering through the glass door, watching as the young couple doted on their tiny daughter. He had never been inside a home before, but he somehow felt connected to this family. For weeks, he lingered nearby. At first, the Reynolds shooed him away, thinking he was just another stray. But soon, they realized Whiskers wasn't like the others. He wasn't looking for food or shelter. He simply wanted to be near their home. Mrs. Reynolds even joked, "Maybe he's our guardian angel." One chilly autumn night, as the wind howled through the streets, something unsettled Whiskers. He had found shelter beneath the Reynolds' porch, curling up into a tight ball for warmth, but an eerie sensation crept over him. His ears twitched, his whiskers trembled, and then he heard it. A faint, muffled cry. It wasn't the sound of a regular baby's whimper. It was weak, barely there, as if calling for help. Whiskers leapt to his feet, his keen senses guiding him. He darted up to the back door, scratching frantically at the wooden frame. Inside, the house was silent. The Reynolds were fast asleep, unaware that their daughter was in distress. With a burst of determination, Whiskers yowled at the top of his lungs, his sharp claws scraping against the door. Again and again, he cried out, his meows growing more desperate. Upstairs, Mrs. Reynolds stirred. She frowned, half asleep, listening to the sound of frantic scratching. "What's that?" she mumbled, nudging her husband. Mr. Reynolds groggily sat up. "It's probably just the wind," he muttered. But then they both heard it, the sharp, persistent cries of a cat. Something wasn't right. Mrs. Reynolds sat up, now wide awake. "It's that stray cat again," she whispered. But something about Whiskers' desperate cries made her uneasy. She had never heard an animal sound so insistent, so urgent. Rushing to Lily's nursery, Mrs. Reynolds gasped. Her baby was struggling, her tiny chest rising and falling unevenly. Her face was turning a shade too pale. Panic surged through her as she gently lifted Lily, realizing she was barely breathing. "Call 911!" she cried, her heart racing. As Mr. Reynolds dialed for help, she cradled Lily, whispering soothing words. But fear clutched at her chest. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They worked quickly, stabilizing the infant and rushing her to the hospital. The ride to the emergency room felt like an eternity for the Reynolds, but finally the doctors emerged with reassuring news. Lily had suffered from a sudden respiratory issue, one that could have been fatal if she had been left untreated for much longer. "She's incredibly lucky you found her when you did," the doctor said. "Had it been a few minutes later..." He trailed off, but the message was clear. The Reynolds were shaken to their core. But more than that, they were grateful. If not for Whiskers, they might have lost their baby that night. When they returned home the next morning, utterly exhausted, but with their baby safe in their arms, they knew who had saved their daughter's life. Whiskers was still sitting outside, his green eyes watching them intently, as if making sure everything was all right. Tears welled in Mrs. Reynolds' eyes as she bent down, scooping the stray cat into her arms for the very first time. "You saved her," she whispered. "You saved our baby." From that moment on, Whiskers was no longer a stray. He had a home, a family, and a place in their hearts forever. The Reynolds made sure he had the warmest bed, the tastiest treats, and all the love he could ever need. Word of Whisker's heroic act spread quickly through the neighborhood. The once-forgotten stray became a local legend, a furry guardian angel who had sensed danger before anyone else had. People from nearby streets came to visit, bringing him toys and treats, patting his head in admiration. The local newspaper even ran a story about him, calling him the cat with a sixth sense. As Lily grew, so did Whisker's bond with her. He became her constant shadow, following her around the house, curling up next to her crib, and even watching over her as she played in the yard. When she took her first steps, Whiskers was there. When she giggled and reached for him, he nuzzled her tiny hands. Years passed, and Whiskers aged, his once sleek fur turning gray. But his protective instincts never faded. Even when Lily started school, he would wait by the door every afternoon, tail flicking, ears perked for the sound of her return. One crisp autumn day, much like the night he had saved her, Whiskers lay on the front porch, watching as Lily played in the yard. His body had grown tired, his movements slower, but he purred contentedly as the little girl he had once rescued laughed and twirled in the golden sunlight. He had done his job. He had kept her safe. That night, Whiskers curled up in his favorite spot by Lily's bed. He closed his eyes as she gently stroked his fur, whispering, "I love you, Whiskers." And as he drifted off into a peaceful sleep, he knew his purpose had been fulfilled. The Reynolds never forgot what Whiskers had done for their family. His story lived on, told time and time again as a reminder that sometimes the smallest creatures have the biggest hearts. Sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear capes. They have whiskers, a tail, and a heart full of love.